Our next speaker comes to us from the state of Kentucky in the United States of America. Michelle Howell is considered in her state to be a champion in recognition of her activism in health and nutrition. She's an energetic force for social justice and betterment. Michelle shared with me that in her school years, she was more focused on relationships, people dynamics, both adults and kids, in place of academics, and she always enjoyed any opportunity for hands-on learning and work. She has had mystical experiences all her life, and she credits her Kundalini process for leading her to the good goals of life partner, parent, farmer, and activist, and her success in those paths. She shared with me the personal stories of Mother Teresa, Harriet Tubman, and Saint Hildegard have all been sources of inspiration for her. It's obvious that she's used them as models for her own life. They define generosity and selfless service, just like Michelle. As we learn of Michelle's life work, her drive and her generosity, I think she qualifies as a 21st century karma yogini. And on behalf of everybody here, I welcome you, Michelle. I'm going to hand the conference over to you, and I'll let you know when time runs short.
Well, thank you so much. I feel very honored, especially after listening to the last few sessions, to have been asked to speak today. I recently told Joan Harrigan that I feel like I've lived on an island, very isolated with all these internal thoughts that have come to me about my experiences. And I feel like a lot of people in the last few months have just like shown up on the island and said, come out here in the world, let us show you what's out here. So I'm just so appreciative. I actually reached out to Terry Degler a few months ago, and I was really asking for help. I had Googled some of the symptoms that I was having with what I believed was related to a spiritual experience, and Gopi Krishna's book came up. I ordered it. That's how I learned about some of these things. And when I read his book, the explanation of what his physical symptoms were, that experience that he had, was very similar to my own. And I also shared with Terry that I had used what I was calling emotional labor. So I was using emotional labor to help others and myself, always thoughtful of making sure I'm included as well, to make those symptoms better. Like, so that was an effort that I was able to make and notice that made it better. And I had actually found her through searching for Saint Hildegard. And so interestingly, Terry immediately said, you're talking about karma yoga. And so I appreciate her expanding my my language and learning new words, as I've done throughout this day as well. And I appreciate being able to share as a layperson, as a wife, as a mother, as a farmer. And my hope is that this will give everyone hope, that somebody from Kentucky that has not been connected to any of these things that you all are sharing in the past was able to live into her experience and reach out and now connect to all of you. Interesting, I was telling my husband, because I haven't shared, this is the first time I'm going to be sharing some of this experience publicly, really. And I was telling my husband, and he said, well, what you're talking about is just good old fashioned country common sense. So that would be his explanation of this. So now I wanted to start by kind of giving a definition to my topic, which is karma yoga to integrate equity into spiritual awakening. That is a mouthful. So I wanted to explain what I'm not talking about, and then try to give a little definition to what I am speaking about, so that there's just some clarity there as I go on. So what I'm not really talking about charity necessarily. I'm not really talking about donating. I'm not talking about helping the helpless. As someone who experienced hunger and abuse and other challenging things as a child, I knew the difference between when somebody showed up to help me genuinely from a place of caring, and when somebody came to help me with some kind of like string attached to that. So I'm very sensitive to that idea. But what I am talking about is this idea of freedom. And I called this kind of the flow point. That's what I've been saying for years, this place of freedom where we can face reality with joy and ease. So when the burdens of the world that were once we were able to face them, that we have some kind of spiritual process so that we are doing that with joy and ease. So we're not causing additional harm. And I thought of three ways that we do this. One of those is in having right relationships with ourselves and others. The second is equitable distribution of resources. So this would be obvious resources like money and shelter and healthcare, but it's also the less obvious resources like having time, having peace of mind, having time to invest in creativity and peace, and even being able to have the time to invest into a spiritual process. And then the third is good authority. And I'm going to use the words good and bad. I just couldn't figure out better words to use. But what I mean by that is a good authority means that it's an authority that cares about our spiritual process, cares about our awakening, cares about us growing as a person. And a bad authority is something that benefits from us not experiencing that awakening. Now, I thought about some barriers to that. So I am coming from a very rural place in Kentucky. There's a lot of poverty here. There's a lot of struggles here. And I wanted to just bring up a few real barriers that a lot of people experience when it comes to having good authority, having equitable distribution of resources, and those right relationships. So the first is it's very hard to recognize good authority when you haven't had a lot of it in your life before. It's just very difficult to do. A lot of people don't have time to invest in growing and learning about new ways of being. It's very difficult to integrate. So if I was to use, let's say, gossiping as an example. So let's say you live in a place where your family, your friends, everyone around you gossips a lot. And you've either had an internal good authority, or maybe you've read it in a book, or you heard somebody say that gossiping causes harm. So you decide, I'm going to stop gossiping. If you don't have time for some kind of spiritual process, some time to really reflect on that, it makes it really, really hard to integrate. So the next time someone's gossiping, you have a hard time making that good decision in that moment. The other two things I think about that are barriers is once you do stop gossiping, so once you do integrate good authority, you start acting from a place of goodness and wholeness and love. It's very easy to be misunderstood. If you're in a culture where good authority isn't the normal way of being, you can be very misunderstood, and that can be very painful and very hard to go through for the first time. The other is you can be very misrepresented or challenged or even threatened. If you are coming from a place of good authority, you will make people uncomfortable. And if you are able to kind of rise above, there's a saying here in Kentucky, don't rise above your raising. Don't get better than us. And if you can really face some challenges and be threatened. But all of that to say, if you're able to recognize good authority, if you're able to integrate it into your life through your prayer practices, through your spiritual awakening practices, if you're able to be willing to be misunderstood by other people, which can be very painful to do, and if you're willing to be misrepresented and challenged, this is the flow point I was talking about. You get to move into this place of creativity and vision and inclusion and peace and clarity. And once you realize that, all of these other things become easier. But you have to be able to work through that, and you have to have people setting that example. I think about a lot of people say like the razor's edge or walking a tightrope. This is exactly what I'm talking about. It is so easy to unintentionally cause harm or to bypass, like we hear spiritual bypassing. But this is being willing to walk right in the center so that you're benefiting and others are as well. So a little bit about my personal experiences. So my mom's family grew up in Kentucky as far back as we know. They, a few generations ago, were able to care for all of their own needs. And then when the railroad came through, families completely lost access to land. They were relocated to city areas, and there were a lot of struggles. In my work with public health, I know that a lot of corporations and companies benefited from the poverty here in Kentucky, and people's health declined, and addictions became a real issue for most people. That became the common thread. My family has been very influenced by the AA program and 12 steps. So that was something that was part of my childhood, but it was something I never felt connected to, since addiction wasn't something my mother and I had faced. My father's family, they are from Sweden, and they were New Americans. They came here with as artists, as glass blowers, and they practiced Lagom, so that the practice of not too much, not too little, but just enough. And that very much influenced me. They also had a lot of trauma. They lost 3 girls at a young age, and it wasn't something you talked about. And that greatly impacted how they raised my father. So my mother and father met. They were both attending university here in Kentucky, and my dad just happened to come to the university here that my mom was going to, where she was from. And they met, they fell in love, they got married, they traveled the world. Everything was going great. They decided, my father actually researched where would be the best place to raise a family. And he bought a house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, just so excited to start a family. So I was a planned pregnancy. But at 5 months into the pregnancy, my mom started having some serious health issues. And it was found that she had a very fast growing brain tumor. And the hospital that she was at said, we really cannot help you. This tumor is going to have to be removed. We're not sure. We do not feel comfortable doing this. She was actually relocated to Nashville, Tennessee, and to Vanderbilt Hospital. And they told her the same thing. We need to terminate the pregnancy so that we can do this brain surgery. She was starting to have strokes. And my mom said she made the decision that she was going to let me decide if I should be born. And she said about that moment, she felt me move for the first time. And so I was born. My father wasn't able to stay in our lives really. And we ended up getting moved away from family. And I had a very unstable childhood with lots of traumas. And I don't really want to focus on that, but I do want to mention that because I do think it's a part of my process. I started recognizing at a young age that I had what I called the feeling. And this was a movement, a feeling inside of my body that would get so strong. I remember one day we were living in a camper, and there was a lot of conflict happening outside of the camper between my mom and my dad. And I remember sitting down in the camper and the feeling getting so strong that I really felt like my body would explode. And so I sat down and I closed my eyes. And I took breaths. And I could feel the feeling moving up my body to the top of my head. And my skull started to crack. And it felt like relief for the first time. And I felt loved and I felt cared for. And I felt very much like I was being told to open my eyes and face reality. And that although what was happening on the outside of my life at the time wasn't right, that I would be able to face it and that I could come back to this place of love anytime. So what I started doing after that was I started looking for this feeling that I was having on the inside, on the outside, out there in the world. And I remember I would quickly label things as, this is that feeling of love. This is not that feeling of love. And the things that felt like love to me were clouds, laying in the grass and watching the clouds move by. I would do this for hours. Being in running water, anytime I could be in water, but particularly running water, and being out in nature. And this just gave me a lot of peace. Now, I was in California at the time. This is where we had been relocated to. And thankfully, even though my life, when you are living like I was, you become prey to predators. And so, unfortunately, I did have just a lot of childhood trauma. But in California, I was able to be outdoors a lot, which was so helpful to me. I was actually a minority. So the school I went to was mostly new Americans from Mexico that had come there to work on fruit and vegetable farms. And I think that this really helped me. This allowed me to be experiencing this real um, trauma, but being surrounded by people that understood and knew. And then the school had resources for kids like me, and it was just very helpful. We had people that would show up and want to take us to church, but these were thankfully hippies. And so women and children were considered equal. And we would sit in circles and drum and go to the desert. And so these were the first experiences of religion that I had, were these hippies that were just fun to be around. And I also got to spend a lot of time alone, which was helpful to me, I believe. Now, as a young girl, I was in a lot of programs, resource programs, because of being so low income. And I remember a social worker coming to me, and she handed me a kiwi. And I held that kiwi, and she said, anytime you have the chance to eat fresh food, you should, because you're worth it. And something happened inside of me. This was the moment when something happened, and that planted a seed for the rest of my life. And I thank her very much for that. That is karma yoga. So we relocated to Kentucky in my early teen years, and there was differences here in Kentucky. So instead of spending time outdoors, we were indoors a lot. There's a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear here. If you're outside, something bad might happen to you. I went to school at first in a kind of high-end school, and that had its own challenges. And we had people from churches that came to pick us up on Sunday, but they were a part of fundamentalist churches. So this was the first time I was hearing things like, you're going to go to hell. Your mother is a sinner and you will always be a sinner. And there was a real fear that because of my life experiences that I would cause harm to people, especially other kids in the church. We were also very busy. So I had lived kind of this more peaceful life before, and now here we were really busy. Thankfully, I can look back now and see that I had a lot of bad authority in my life, but it was very transient. It would come in, people would be really inspired to help me, be my father figure, do these things. But I was able to choose what stuck, because there wasn't any of that was really ingrained into me. And when I look at my community, when I look at our culture, I can see that a lot of people are acting in a way just because that bad authority was so present in their life, and it was all that they knew. So I do feel thankful for that. Now, at this point in time, that feeling started coming back. And what I realized is that when I went internally and looked for love, and I breathed, and I laid in the grass and looked at clouds, I made the people around me, my teachers, family, neighbors, very uncomfortable. They were very concerned that I might have Tourette's or psychosis. I was put into therapy. I started developing UTIs and fevers and rashes and constipation and a lot of health issues. Now, thankfully for that, it was suggested that I start taking dance classes and piano. Interestingly, my mom couldn't drive. And so the only way for me to get there was to walk or ride a bike. And that got me back outdoors. And so I can just see how Kundalini has been actively involved in my life, helping me find the right path, even when things were hard. So something I started doing about this time, I think I had done it very naturally in California, but in Kentucky, I wanted to start doing this again, which is repositioning power. And so what I would do is, when I sensed there was conflict around me, I would breathe that in, and I would breathe it out love. And when I would do that, a lot of times I would get some guidance on how I might be helpful to someone. So, and here's an example I can remember, but this would happen pretty regularly. So I'd be in class, a teacher and a peer would be in conflict. It was very distracting to the class. It was very distracting to me. And I could tell that they were hurting themselves by doing this. And as I was breathing in their pain and breathing out love, I recognized and realized, oh, my teacher is suffering and she's sad because she's had to leave her baby at home and she misses him. And this boy is sad right now because his father abuses him at home. And so there would be little things that I could do that could help them feel love and help them connect to one another in a new way. And then I would just move out of the way. And this was a way that I realized that there was a power that came from this internal love that could be shared with others and be of help. Now, I think I started over giving during this time, overdoing this, and I developed an illness that nobody could identify. So for 3 months, I missed school. During the day, I would be in so much pain that I would, within 30 minutes, I might be laying on the dining room table, laying on the bathroom floor, trying to go walk outside, laying in my bed, laying on the couch, just looking for some kind of relief from this pain. I would eventually be diagnosed with mono, although the doctor would say he wasn't quite sure that was the issue. The other thing that happened during this time is in the evening while I was asleep, I was visited by an older woman. And not thinking the people around me, I needed to tell someone this because it was happening and I was having a hard time distinguishing between, is this real or is this not real? And I remember saying it out loud. And it was an older woman, a wise woman. And she was telling me, you are right. Some of these things you see around you are not good. They are not for you. Really keep your spiritual practices going. These things from childhood. I wouldn't have called them spiritual practices, but and I remember trying to tell someone that. And I remember the only way I could make sense of it to people around me, even though it was an older woman, that wiser woman, I said it was Cindy Crawford from a magazine. And it was all of a sudden okay that I was having this experience because you must just want to be like Cindy Crawford someday. So it was kind of the first time I started realizing I have to be careful what I say and to who. So I got back into school after 3 months sick, and I was put into remedial classes, remedial math classes, agriculture classes, and I fell in love with learning for the first time. I ended up getting a job at a local orchard, loved being outside, working with my hands. And then I became the first young woman to be president of our FFA chapter. So that's Future Farmers of America. And luckily I had been, when I started back to school, I was moved to a new school. And this was a school that was very diverse. The community I live in is 1 in 6 people are refugees. And so it was a very diverse school. And when you're president of the FFA and you're involved in that organization, you kind of create a platform. And so mine was creating equity and justice in the local food system and increasing the amount of local foods that are being grown locally and bought locally. And this was the first time that I realized that speaking out loud about equity and justice makes people very unhappy. And so I started to realize that, and it was very painful. One morning I woke up and I just hit the floor in pain, pain in my lower right side, pain in my back. I was in the hospital for a week. They couldn't identify what was wrong. And to be honest, I went back to school. It was the very end of my senior year. And I decided that I was honestly kind of done with this whole spiritual, physical experience. And I said, I'm going to just try out this whole American dream idea. And so I started doing really, really well in school, went to college, did really well there. If you could say that there was one job that was everyone's dream job after college, I graduated from college and at 21 years old, got that dream job. And I decided to have a family, start a family. I met my husband, Nathan. He grew up on a full-time farm in a very rural area. He is unlike anyone I've ever known because he's very simple. Like I said, uses country common sense as a way to describe this. But he's also very open-minded. And so after we had our son, I started kind of contemplating on 2 life experiences I had had in the last few years during my trial with the American Dream. And one of them was my first job, that Nathan and I were actually peers in, this was around the year 2000. Farmers in Kentucky found out that the way that they were making ends meet and staying on their farm was going away, and that was with tobacco. So these tobacco farmers were losing their tobacco acreage. And so our job, working for the University of Kentucky, was to assist tobacco farmers in growing new crops. And so one of the ideas was fruits and vegetables. And we would have these field days on these farms, and people were desperate to figure out something, a solution. And I was the only woman in this role. And the men were making plans to grow fruits and vegetables just like tobacco. So commodities, 10 acres of cantaloupe, and we're going to sell them to Kroger or Walmart. And my job as the woman in this role was to host the potlucks. And so I would get to sit around with the other women, and they would have these dreams of, back in the day, we used to grow backyard gardens and we grew all these fruits and vegetables. And I really believe we could do that again. And we would eat better and we could grow food for our neighbors and the people that we know. And once again, when I would start passionately talking about this to people, I realized how upset it made people. It was said it would never work. But this fire started coming back in me, believing that it could. The second thing is that in a job that I had where I was a manager within public works, I had 7 men that worked for me, and most of them were part-time employees, and they had been there forever. And they would invite me to lunch, and a lot of them lived in the housing authority, or their mother still lived in the housing authority. So here we would be sitting here at lunch. There's a train. Can you all hear it? Or is it too loud? It goes by quick. So these men would invite me to lunch, and we'd be sitting around. And what I realized was that with my peers, with the other professionals, lunch would be conversations about, I'm just so overworked. I don't get to spend time with my family. I don't get to see my children very much. And just a lot of struggle. And here in the housing authority with these men, that it was my job to try to convince them to work more, to be more full-time employees instead of part-time. But the conversations were about how connected they were to family, how they wanted to come home and have lunch with their mother, how they couldn't wait to do things in the evenings with their children. And I couldn't help but think that maybe things had been flipped upside down. And so we went on vacation not too long after this, and we visited some spiritual sites at Tulum. And I started, for the first time since my American Dream experiment, I had started waking up to pray and to sit in silence. And I truly believe that it was visiting those spiritual sites and a willingness to be contemplative about the experiences I've had and the life I want to have. Now, I would have given credit to the self-help book that I picked up at the airport at the time, but I do believe that there was a spiritual calling to this. So on the last morning of our vacation, our trip, I had clear as day guidance given to me. I got a piece of paper out, and this guidance, the spiritual guidance, said, quit your job, learn how to cook healthy meals, drink more water, breathe, and get outdoors. For 15 years, I would wake up every single morning and write those things down on a piece of paper. Sometimes I might get a few additional little nuggets there, but it was very, very simple, that I was being called to live a more peaceful life. So I did quit my job. I was the main breadwinner at the time, and so it was difficult. My husband was took a little bit by shock, but we made it work, and it was a process, but we made it work. I was also very naive that in Kentucky you just say, I'm going to eat healthy, I'm going to drink water, I'm going to breathe more, and I'm going to go outdoors. I thought, I don't know, I had a zeal about myself, but thankfully, especially in the beginning, the Holy Spirit just took care of things. I can't even explain. They just got took care of. Later in life, I look back and go, oh my goodness, like, how in the world did this even happen the way that it did? So I spent a lot of time, and I also had 4 children under the age of 6 during this time. So I was busy, but it was just a peaceful busy. And I was so in tune to the Holy Spirit and what I was being called to do. And really, when you're that busy, when you have that many young children in the home, people leave you alone. There wasn't a lot of people expecting much from me. And so I was able to wake up in the morning and just really follow what the Holy Spirit called me to do that day. And it was just a very beautiful time. But I was also doing a lot of noticing of things happening around me. And I was also doing a lot of non-doing. And what I realized was that this took a lot of effort. So this non-doing of knowing there was something I could do, but choosing not to because there was a benefit to me not doing. Now in 2008, so this would be about 8 years later, some things started to change a little bit. I started to receive additional internal authority or good authority in my life, things to write down on that piece of paper, ways to be more in action for myself, in action for other people. And I think this was in part from some external good authority I was receiving, because there was really, up to this point, there was nobody else around me that understood the importance of eating healthy, drinking water, breathing, spending time outdoors. But I was starting to realize that there was this external good authority, and that was online. That was the first year I had a computer where I had access to information outside of basically what was happening in my community. And I was also getting out into new spaces. So we had a refugee center that I spent a lot of time in, met a lot of friends, at the farmers market, different places outside of just my regular family unit and the church that we attended at the time. Now, a lot of this action was centered around birth, breastfeeding, faith, death and natural burial, womanhood, motherhood. That was kind of the topics of things that I was feeling like I needed to be taking some more action over. I remember about that time that I heard the quote by Peggy O'Mara, which is, "The way we speak to our children becomes their inner voice." And that was the moment that I realized that I could control my mind, that I could hear a message or a voice inside my mind, and I could question it. I could say, is that true? Is that something that I want to, live out, live into, share? And I also realized that this generational trauma that I had experienced didn't have to be passed on to the next generation. Thankfully, a lot of the things that I was feeling called to take action in had evidence-based information. There was research to back these things up. So in the beginning, there was a real honeymoon phase to this work, to my activism. Being online gave me easy and quick ways to get engaged and involved. But very quickly, because I started to experience a little bit of success, I started to be misunderstood, challenged, threatened, and it was very hard. I want to give you an example of that. So when I started to realize that I needed to lean into some action on these things I had been noticing, I did not want to create something that was exclusive, that was kind of high end, that was for people with financial means. So meaning that if I was, one of the things I want to do was to create more mother-baby friendly practices in the hospital. And I saw that there was already plenty of things out there for people who could hire a doula or a lactation consultant, but a lot of people were left out of that. So I contacted the health department very naively, and I said, can I come and talk to some of you all about these ideas I have? And interestingly, they had just hired an entire staff of preventative care staff that the research was saying we need to care about the ways that we treat mothers when they're giving birth, and the way that we treat babies, and the connection between the two of them. And so this was something they were interested in. And so I started creating these monthly gatherings. And they were for doctors, nurses, lactation consultants, and mothers of all kinds, fathers of all kinds, to come together and work towards better policy, new policy. And we got rather successful. We were able to create new policies, new programs. And I was invited to speak about this at the Kentucky Public Health Conference. I spoke nationally to several different organizations about my work as just as a layperson and how I had assisted with this. So soon after, I got a call from a friend at the health department that said, we're getting ready to have a meeting. We would love for you to come. Another friend called me and said, make sure you get there on time and make sure you dress nicely. And my thought was, if they want me to be there early and dress nicely, and that's very important that I'm there, I must be getting an award. That was my thought. These people are going to award me for my effort. So when I got there and I walked in the room and I saw their faces, I realized I wasn't getting an award. I was being told that if I was going to continue doing my work and including lower income moms, the refugee community, and others, that I would no longer be able to be in this group. And this was a group that I had created. And I sat there for a minute, and with tears in my eyes, I couldn't really believe this was happening. You know, I had walked in ready for my award. And so I knew what I had to do. So I stood up and I walked out of the room. And I thought that I would never work with these people again, with professionals. I thought that was it. And I was willing for that to be it. But the interesting thing is that when you do the right thing, the right people notice. And so while there were a lot of people in the room who didn't want me to extend this effort and this benefit to people in the community that might be lower income, there were people in the room that really respected me even more now. And they would reach out to me later. But I would continue to have experiences just like that over and over again in the church, in the local food movement, farming community. And it was very, very painful. And I believe that I was, really led and guided during that time. Now, in 2011, we became full-time farmers. This was a really big step for us to both become, quit our jobs. And, my husband decided to quit his job as well to farm full time. But we really felt like if we cared about local food and the food system, that being full-time farmers was the best way we could serve others. Now, this was a very busy time for us. And we also experienced some success. And I love that Carl Jung says nothing fails like success, because when you have successes in life, it does make things different. So when you're just helping, when you're just showing up and kind of being the busy woman that kind of gets stuff done and serving other people, that's one thing. But when you show up and have success in what you're doing, it does change things. I did have to face my own sense of specialness in a really painful way during this time. But that led me to spend more time in contemplation. A friend gave me a copy of the book, The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which was very, very helpful to me at the time. I had only really for a very long period of time knew Christianity in the way that the fundamentalist church teaches it. So to be given something that opened my mind was very, very helpful. And I really started living a life of prayer and work. So ora et labora. And somebody saw that was the way I was living, and they kind of gave me those words, said, this is what you're doing. In 2015, my father called me, and I had not seen my father in over a decade. And he called to tell me that he had cancer and he was dying, and he wanted to know if I would come take care of him. Now, no one around me believed this was a good idea, but I knew it would be something I would have to do. So it took my father 10 days to die, and it was a very painful time. And I can struggle with crying. I have a hard time crying. And at the moment of his death, I cried uncontrollably for 24 hours. Now, at the time, I had been giving so much to my community that I expected that when I returned home, that my community would have been taking care of my husband, taking care of my kids, excited to see me, more than happy to give back what I've given to them. And that wasn't what happened. I can see now that I had used my skills and abilities to sort of attract people that that could use harm with those skills and gifts and abilities. In overgiving and even controlling and manipulating with my skills and gifts and abilities, I had attracted this, and this had caused harm. Soon after, I would find out I was pregnant, and this created a hard stop in my life. And it also allowed me a lot of time to reflect. And during this time, I started really tightening up what I wanted my work to be about. And that was creating opportunity for everyone. And meaning, and I guess a step back, what I really meant was some of the people that I had attracted in my life were happy when what I was doing, using my skills and gifts and abilities to help them, but they weren't necessarily willing or interested in me helping other people. And they had started to make that very clear. And so I had said, if I'm going to invest my time outside of my home and our farm and my family, it's going to be to create opportunity for others and to be helpful, to be truly helpful. And the second is I really wanted to create access to health. Really, I truly believe that healthy food can be something that can be very powerful in people's life, because I've experienced it myself. What I realized is when I started really thinking about the opportunity, creating opportunity and holding space for that for others, and then the access to health pieces, I realized how much we exclude mothers and kids and frontline workers and teens and elders and people of color. And, holding space for other people so they could own their own businesses, so they could, make ends meet for themselves, so that they could, step into their own spiritual awakening, really would be the motivation. I had to start doing a lot of my own internal work. And part of this was letting go of preferences for others. And this was with my husband, my children, other farmers, people in the community, what I realized at the time is how much emotional labor, how much time in the day it takes to make sure that we're not causing harm to others. And so I was able to let go a lot of the specialness and, and people started presenting some of these ideas to me. Thankfully, they kind of showed up with things that were very helpful to me at the time. And I was able to start putting words on what I was experiencing or seeing other people experience, the gatekeeping and gaslighting that can happen to people when they're trying to live into that good authority. I wouldn't really even consider myself much of an activist, as much of probably a contemplative advocate. And so somebody gave me one of the things that somebody gave me that was really, really helpful was the rule of Saint Benedict. And because I was really questioning at the time, how can this work that I'm doing that is successful, that I know is holding space for other people, repositioning power to other people, how can it feel so wrong sometimes? And so in the rule, in the rule of St. Benedict, there are some leadership skills or leadership things that really resonated with me. So things like having strong ethics, removing layers of bureaucracy, being lean and self-sufficient. We were very careful about who we took money from, if at all, and built everything on very, very little without debt. So important. Job assignments by merit, so people deserving what they're given. Facing grumbling head on. That was probably the one that most people were like, you can't show up and say that, or you can't, but facing grumbling head on, and space for innovation. And so soon after that, I visited the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is about a little over an hour from my house. And I spent a week in silence with the monks. And this week sped up my spiritual awakening really fast. um, because they surprised me over and over and over again. So the first was I pulled in and there was this man, he was on a mower and he had a UK shirt and a Budweiser hat. And my immediate thought was, this is so nice that these monks have hired one of their neighbors, you know, because it's a very rural, kind of low income community, to come here and work for them. And it was time for prayer. So I went straight into prayer. And who's the first monk that walks in the door but the man who had been on the mower? When I went to get my key to my room, the monk said, here's the key to your room. If you lose it, come find me. I'll give you another one. That's such grace. That's not how we usually say, these are the rules. You must follow them. Don't lose your key. But they said the opposite. They said, you know, if you want to go to prayer, you can. If you want to go to the library, you can. If you want to walk the grounds, this is your week, freedom. And that was the first experience I had had with freedom when it came to faith, being offered that by others. In the opening session, there's like a 30-minute time where they talk and they do a teaching. The monk told us about how holy his niece was. And his niece works at Hooters.
Michelle, 5
Yeah.
minutes.
Okay. So anyway, and they gave us so much love, gave me so much love during that week. So soon after that, I was introduced, a good friend, Kathy, who I had no idea was a sister of a monastery, said, I would love for you to come visit my monastery. It's in Eastern Kentucky. I love that I didn't know that she was a sister of a monastery, even though I'd known her for years. So I went to visit. What I love about Mount Tabor Monastery is they had originally been members of another monastery. The sisters are all in their 70s now, but they had joined at 16 years old, a couple of the sisters. And they had realized that there wasn't that much good authority around them. And so they left that monastery and started an ecumenical monastery in Eastern Kentucky. And the beauty of what they've created is just amazing and so welcoming. And one of them gave me a picture of St. Hildegard. And there's a quote on it that says, the longing of the spirit can never be stilled. And that was so important for me to hear because I had been trying to still the spirit inside of me. Soon after that, I was in a car accident that made the feeling come back on, and I would have that feeling for several years. I would try to use every healing modality possible, but thankfully, I finally realized I was having a Kundalini awakening. Soon after that, after I was able to start integrating more karma yoga, more spiritual practices, and understand what I was going through, we would face a pandemic. Locally, we faced tornadoes that killed 16 people in my community, social unrest a couple hours away with the protest for the killing of Breonna Taylor that affected several of my friends very much, and then deadly flooding after that. And thankfully, I was surrounded by these people that asked good questions, and they were the ones that had all the right answers in those moments. And it reminded me of these beautiful moments of the spirit working. And all of a sudden, people around me started noticing the work that I did and wanted to know why it worked. Unfortunately, everyone wanted to get back to normal really quickly. But I think karma yoga has allowed me to have the willingness to ask if I'm misunderstanding anyone, if I'm misrepresenting other people, if I'm challenging anyone, and then allow any of those feelings that I might have that could cause harm to be healed. And on the other side of that, I get to lighten up and have vulnerability and presence and ease and joy and creativity. And I'm surrounded by so much vibrant energy with my elders who I respect so much, and teenagers and people of color that are just fun. This work can be so much fun. And so, I believe that karma yoga, when it's done for the benefit of ourselves and other people, helps us to start to recognize even more good authority. So being here in this space and just listening to the sessions I have, I recognized it as good authority, and it's helping me to understand more about my experience. And what I hope is that I'll continue and continue becoming good authority myself.
Michelle, thank you very much. Your heartfelt talk this afternoon has really been very, very moving for us. I think that in time to come, we're going to reflect back on everything that you said and all the experiences you've been through, and realize that you are a role model for everybody who listened today. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yep.